is Rich Greathouse. I was born and raised in Richwood, West Virginia. Imagine that. Is it? Okay, so I was born and raised in Richwood, West Virginia, and as you sit there, I can imagine that you have a question. How did you get into doing this? Well, going through school, I was always very interested in history. It was probably my favorite subject. I did West Virginia history in 8th grade. I took the Golden Horseshoe test. I missed it by just a little bit. I think I needed 3 points to get the Golden Horseshoe or something like that. But I was always very interested in history, West Virginia history, American history, everything like that. And I came to 9th grade, and we had a class in 9th grade that was called speed reading. It was kind of an English course, but it was a speed reading class, and it was taught by Mrs. Amick, who was the wife of Fred Amick, a longtime principal at Richwood Junior High School, which is now demolished. Those middle school kids are in pods just like they are here in Elkview. So I was in speed reading class, and we're going through, of course, Mrs. Amick, she's teaching us how to speed read. And basically it's that you can scan pages quickly and get the general summary of what's on each page, and then you move on. But it's just a really quick way of reading, and it's been very valuable to me since I took that class. But the last assignment in that class was we had to write a research paper using all the research skills that she taught us in that class. And I happened to choose to do my research paper on the Battle of Chickamauga, which that's over there in Tennessee, is it? Tennessee area? So I did my paper on the Battle of Chickamauga, and of course that's a Civil War battle. And as I was up presenting my paper, Miss Amick asked me a question, and basically that question was, do you know if any of your ancestors fought in the Civil War? I did not know, but I told her that I would find out and I would get back to her. Well, on down through the years, right out of high school, I went in the Army. I served in the Army for 8 years. And of course, I didn't get to do much research while I was in the Army. But when I came home, I got into trying to research my family history, even more than I'd done already. And I was at a big brick wall. Basically, my second great-grandfather, who was in Richwood, or my first great-grandfather who was in Richwood, he had a Bible that said that his father's name was Tass Greathouse, and that his wife was Sarah Elizabeth Greathouse. So we're searching for Tass, T-A-S, we're searching for Tass Greathouse. We're not finding him, not finding anything on him at all. And so we start looking for Sarah Elizabeth Greathouse, and of course, we didn't have her maiden name, didn't know what her maiden name was, so we was a dead end there. Well, in 1998, I received this email from a fellow named Frank Naher. He was leading what they called at the time, him and another lady, Pat Greathouse, Patricia Dodd Greathouse, they were leading a group called the Greathouse the Greathouse Data Exchange. And basically what that was a group of Greathouses all across the USA that was exchanging information about their family's history. And so he sent me a big long email basically telling me what the Greathouse Data Exchange was. And he asked me to send him what I knew about my family. So I did. Surprise, surprise. As soon as he got it, they plugged in Sarah Elizabeth Greathouse as Sarah Elizabeth Tanner, the granddaughter of Samuel Tanner and Spencer. And from there, they knew that she had married a man named Isaac B. Greathouse. So once they sent me that information, I gained Isaac B. Greathouse, his father Edward Greathouse, and then his father John Greathouse. And then John Greathouse married Sarah McDade. They settled in Spencer, West Virginia in 1817. So you've got 3 generations of my family there in Spencer. So I continued on trying to find that John Greathouse's father. Now that John Greathouse was born at an opportune time. He was bound to have a Revolutionary War father. He appears to have been born in March 1778. If you do the math on that, he would have been conceived in June 1777, and that's the year that I'm going to talk about a lot tonight. So we know that his father was living in June 1777, but there's no record of his father being with his son at any time. So we think that his father probably died as a soldier in the Revolutionary War. So you start looking at people. I mean, we connected, of course, we had all the information from Herman Greathouse in Philadelphia. We had his sons. We had his sons traveled west into West Virginia. So we start looking at each of the sons that were possible to be the parents of John Greathouse. And we're not really finding anything. But we do find this one interesting Greathouse. He appears to have been born in Philadelphia city. He was probably born there about 1749. He gets up to 1770. He marries a wife. Her name was Katharina Sibylla. We don't know what her last name is. She was just called Katharina Sibylla Greathouse. And that's the German variant of the Greathouse surname, is Greathouse. Oftentimes it's called, or they say it as Grotenhausen. But we just recently found that the Herman Greathouse, who came to Philadelphia in 1710, he came from a small town about 5 miles west of Bielefeld, Germany. And that town is Gross-Dornberg, Germany. And if you go look at Gross-Dornberg, Germany, there is a prominent farm on the map that is owned by George Greathouse today. And we recently just connected with some people who have researched that farm all the way back to 1500, and it was held by Greathouses in 1500. And apparently Y-DNA is proving that those Greathouses are the ones responsible for the Herman Greathouse who came to America, and then all the children that he had down through the years as they migrated west to wherever they've gone. So that's the Greathouse story.
But you wouldn't be able to prove your SAR through Greathouses.
I will not be able to prove the SAR through my Greathouses because we cannot determine who the parents of John Greathouse was. Now, I have some ideas who his parents was. There was a William Greathouse and Mary in Harrison County. They could have been his parents, but there's one fellow, that Jacob Greathouse, who was married in Philadelphia City in 1770. He had a son on 24 December 1770. And then he got into some trouble. That son was baptized in February. Then you come to March 1777, 71, and you find a court record where he stole 1,500 pounds from his employer. And the court records say that he was an apprentice to George Cooper, who was a tanner, a skinner. He went out in the woods and he killed animals and brought them in for the skins. He made leggings like what I have on here. And I was going to go into this, but what you see here is what they would have worn in this area as they were working their farms. And of course, this is known as a long hunter kit. Basically, you have a hunting frock. I have trousers on, but oftentimes they wore breeches, which were the pants that go to the knees. Of course, I have a rifle. I have a powder horn. I have a shot pouch. Have a canteen.
Shot pouch, you said?
Yeah, it's shot pouch or possible bag. And then this is a haversack for carrying like your provisions, your knife, fork, the things that you would need to set up camp, whatever like that. Of course, you got your knives, skinning knives, and then you got your tomahawk that you about had to have in this area because of Indians. But this is how the long hunters would have dressed in this area. Oftentimes, when they were out working their farms, they would just be in a shirt like this one here, which you can pass around. They'd have been out working their fields in just trousers or breeches and a shirt like that. Of course, they would have their rifle and their bag and powder close by just in case they encountered any Indians. Or redcoats, which that's a joke that we like to use whenever we're out working with people. We'll be walking down the street and some of us will say, have you seen any redcoats or Indians around these parts? And people just start laughing. But it's just a little fun joke that we use. But back to Jacob Greathouse. So he steals money from George Cooper, 1,500 pounds. He carries it off to a house in South Ward of Philadelphia City. He gets caught by a constable. So he gives the constable a confession and tells him where the money is. Then he goes before a grand jury and he's tried for the crime of larceny, basically. Then in April, the grand jury came back with his judgment that he was to receive 24 lashes in 4 of the public squares of Philadelphia City. So really, that's all we know about him in Philadelphia City. I mean, the records stop right there. But all of a sudden, now this was just a happenstance, if you will. But as you research the history of this area, you learn of a man named Simon Kenton. Pretty much everybody knows Simon Kenton. He was on his farm in Fauquier County, Virginia, and he had a neighbor. He had a beautiful neighbor that he was in love with, but she liked the man next door. So Simon Kenton is wanting to court her, and the man next door is courting her. So Simon Kenton strikes up a fight with this man, and Simon thinks that he killed this man. So he starts running from the law. He takes off from his home. He comes all the way to Isis Ferry, just up by Morgantown. And he meets a man by the name of, I think it was Joseph Butler, who had a farm there near Isis Ferry. And so he came there, told Joseph Butler that he was family, said his last name was Butler too. And he often went by Simon Butler whenever he was visiting places. But he told Joseph Butler that he was family from the east. So he ended up working for Joseph Butler there on his farm. And Joseph Butler was a gunsmith. So he made Simon Kenton his first gun, which Simon Kenton called Jacob. Simon Kenton named his gun Jacob. So you keep following Simon Kenton, and you basically find that when he left Joseph Butler's farm, he went up to the forks of the confluence of the Monongahela River, or the Monongalia River, and I guess it's Monongahela. But the Monongahela and the Cheat River, and right there you had what was called Wilson's and Kincaid's Ferry. Basically, it was a ferry barge that went across the river, across the Cheat River to the other side, and it provided a way for people to travel into from like Virginia to Pennsylvania. They crossed over to Pennsylvania right there. So George Wilson had a boat making endeavor going on there, flatboats. He made flatboats to go down the Monongahela River to Pittsburgh. So Simon Kenton comes there and he meets a man named Jacob Greathouse. Remember I said he disappeared in Philadelphia? Well, here's Simon Kenton comes, and he's wanting to go to the sugar fields in Kentucky. So he comes here and he meets a party building boats to go down the Ohio River. So he pursues to join them. And this party going down the Ohio River was Jacob Greathouse, William Grills, and two Mahan brothers who lived in Morgantown. So long story short, Simon Kenton wants to go downriver with them, but unfortunately, a man named David Duncan came for the Mahan brothers, and he told them that he saw their father in Indian captivity over on the Scioto River. So this group of men, Jacob Greathouse, William Grills, the Mahan brothers, and David Duncan, they are all hardened frontiersmen. And here Simon Kenton is green as he can be, doesn't know anything about Indians. So they're like, you know, we really think you should stay here and get some experience. You're green. You're not up to this trip. So Simon Kenton didn't like it, but he stayed behind, and he ended up getting in a party with George Yeager and John Strader. They ended up coming down to Kentucky, and they did find some sugarcane fields, and they hunted and trapped along the Kanawha River. And basically, if you go to the Elk River and go up the Big Chimney, just up from there a little bit, there's a place called 2 Mile Creek. Their camp was on 2 Mile Creek, just up below the ridge. And what they would do is they would camp there during the night, and then they would go out and hunting during the day. Well, they was also crossing the ridge over to Burning Springs to get salt. So here you have Simon Kenton, George Yeager, and John Strader. They're hunting out of that camp. They come into camp one day after hunting all day. They were fixing a meal, and George Yeager was cooking at the fire. And all of a sudden, they sense Indians are all around them. A shot's fired. George Yeager dies immediately. He's shot and he's killed right on the spot. Simon Kenton and John Strader, they'd just come in. The story is they took their clothes off, so they fled. They didn't have clothes, they didn't have their guns, anything. They fled. They ended up running 6 days to reach the Ohio River just about 6 miles north of Point Pleasant. When they came out of the woods there on the riverbank, they were exhausted. They were pretty much near death. They hadn't eaten. And they just happened to come out on the Ohio River 6 miles north of Point Pleasant, where a flatboat crew had just come ashore. Guess who that was? Jacob Greathouse. Well, at that time, Jacob Greathouse, William Grills, and the Mahan brothers, they had joined with Joel Reese, who was a surveyor on William Crawford's expedition to survey the lands for George Washington. So, I mean, you find something like that, and you're just sitting there looking at it, and you're like, wow, you know. Here this guy is, Jacob Greathouse. Of course, this was 1774. So there they are, Simon Kenton. They take Simon Kenton up to Dr. John Briscoe, who was at Vienna, West Virginia. He settled at Vienna, West Virginia. Dr. John Briscoe takes on Simon Kenton and heals him, and John Strader. They were all pretty badly injured. He heals them up so that they can continue on. Simon Kenton comes on down to the Kanawha River, and he ends up joining with the Thomas Bullitt party going into Kentucky surveying. In the meantime, you have the party of Jacob Greathouse, William Grills, the Mahan brothers, they're all the way back up at Morgantown area. So when Simon Kenton comes back from his expedition, he meets with them again, and they come on another hunting trip downriver to Canova, where they camped for that winter. They hunted and trapped for furs all that winter. And then we come to like March 1774. Of course, everybody knows that's the lead up to Dunmore's War in October. So they're camped in Canova in 1774, March. People's coming down the river telling them that the hostilities with the Indians on the upper river are increasing and that they should evacuate back to Pittsburgh. So they say that there was a French trader in that area somewhere, and Simon Kenton and his team, again, Jacob Greathouse, William Grills, and the two Mahan brothers. And now there was two other guys with them, Samuel Cartwright and a Joseph Locke. So they go to the French trader, they sell their furs, and they ascend the Ohio River back to Fort Pitt. Well, you come along and you find this story, and pretty much it's in a book by John MacDonald called The Life of General Simon Kenton.
The life what?
The Life of General Simon Kenton. And basically, you don't know this until you get to the back of the book, but John MacDonald went to Simon Kenton's farm in 1830, and he interviewed him. And the story in this book is the interview with Simon Kenton that John MacDonald did in 1830. So, I mean, that's first-hand information right there. Simon Kenton says that they closed up their camp, they went to Pittsburgh, and he said on the way up that all the settlements they went through were deserted. So that means everybody that was in those settlements, like before April 1774, by the time Simon Kenton and his team went through those settlements, they were deserted. So you're looking at March, April, and then on April 30th, you have the incident with Chief Logan, where Chief Logan's family was killed at Baker's Bottom by a group of men who was led by Daniel Greathouse. So here you've got Daniel Greathouse and you've got Jacob Greathouse down here with Simon Kenton. You have everybody thinking that Daniel Greathouse and Jacob Greathouse were brothers, but Daniel Greathouse was born in Hampshire County, West Virginia, while Jacob Greathouse was born in Philadelphia. So I think they were more like first cousins. But then you continue following Jacob Greathouse and you find that he went back to Morgantown, West Virginia. And as the fires heated up leading to the Revolutionary War, you had all these companies being formed by the Continental Congress. In 1776, the German regiment was formed. And basically it was 3 Pennsylvania companies, 3 Maryland companies they raised. And just so happens that one of those companies was Captain William Heiser's, which he raised in Cumberland, Maryland. And you come across the rosters of Captain William Heiser's company. There you have Jacob Greathouse and another fellow, Robert Hartness. So you follow these guys, and the German regiment ends up in Quibbletown, New Jersey, where you have muster rolls naming Jacob Greathouse and Robert Hartness on those muster rolls in October.
Are you saying Robert Hartness or
Hartness.
H-A-T?
Hartness. It's also in the records as Hark, Harkness. So you start tracking these two men, and you go to June or May and July 1777, Captain William Heiser's company. and you find their names on the muster rolls for that company, but it says that they deserted November 1st, 1776. Well, everybody knows during the Revolutionary War that during the harvest season, men left their companies to go harvest their crops. So you had all these desertions coming in the papers, but that was actually men leaving their companies to go harvest their crops. So you're like, okay, here's Jacob Greathouse and Robert Hartness and Captain William Heiser's company in October 1777. Where did they go? Well, you don't know until you go search Colonel David Shepard's records in Wheeling for Fort Henry, there in Wheeling. You go into his memorandum books and you find that in March 1777, Captain Samuel Mason's company received provisions and Robert Hartness' name was on that roster. Okay, so you're expecting to see Jacob Greathouse too. Well, you don't see Jacob Greathouse until the first siege of Fort Henry, when he is a member of Captain Samuel Mason's company, who was the garrison for Fort Henry. There were other companies all around Fort Henry, like there was Beach's Fort, there was another company there. Any fort in that area had a company at it. And when the Indians attacked Fort Henry on September 1st, word got out to those companies, and several of them made it into Fort Henry to help garrison the fort. So everybody knows about the first siege of Fort Henry. It occurred September 1st, 1777. The other event that happened was just 26 days later on September 27th, 1777. And just a little lead up to why this all happened. Back with Jacob Greathouse and Robert Hartness in the German regiment in Philadelphia, you also had that regiment, well, another regiment, the 8th Pennsylvania, when they arrived. You just had the battles of Trenton and Princeton. So you had those men fighting in the battles of Trenton and Princeton. And one of the officers that distinguished himself in the battles of Trenton and Princeton was General Edward Hand. He distinguished himself so much that George Washington gave him a brigadier general's commission in the field. And part of his orders was to come to Pittsburgh to take command of the garrison of the western frontier at Pittsburgh. So he arrives at Pittsburgh in like the spring of 1777. And of course the Indians have been making all this trouble. And he's like, we gotta build an expedition against the Indians. We gotta march against them. We gotta go take them out. We gotta go put them down, basically. So he starts calling for militiamen, militia companies from all over this part of Virginia, western Pennsylvania, to assemble at Fort Henry. So you have all these militiamen coming into Fort Henry, and they're there about August, and the campaign was supposed to begin in August, but due to several other things, the campaign didn't begin. So you have all these militia companies there at Fort Henry in Wheeling, and they are requiring food. They're having to drive cattle in to feed them. So there they are eating the food, and they're having to supply this. So General Edward Hand receives these letters from his officers saying, all these soldiers are eating us out of house and home. The local people can't get enough food for themselves for these soldiers being here. So General Edward Hand sent orders to disband those militia companies at Fort Henry. Well, the Indians across the Ohio River, they are watching. They see all these militia companies leave Fort Henry. So that is what compelled them to come in and attack Fort Henry on September 1st, 1777. Of course, the thing that most presenters always tell you about 1777 is that it was the year of Bloody Sevens. Basically, there were times when the Ohio River ran with blood during that year because there was so much fighting on the Ohio River. So that brings us to the Battle of Fort Henry's over. They're still calling in militia to come defend Fort Henry. So a call goes out to Hampshire County, who sends Captain William Foreman with his company of men from Hampshire County. So same thing happens with him. His men get to Fort Henry. They're itching for a fight. They want to go attack the Indians, but the orders never come. So they're getting bored in the fort. And along comes September 26th. In the night sky to the south, they see fires burning. Well, they know that Joseph Tomlinson's settlement is to the south at Elizabethtown. So here these fires are in the night sky, so they want to go check on Joseph Tomlinson's family. So on September 26th, they formed William Foreman led his company out, and several from the garrison of Captain Samuel Mason went with Captain Foreman. They marched down to Elizabethtown. They found the houses and the log cabins and the canoes. Well, the houses were burned. The canoes all had holes in them, and they were in the river, so they camped there overnight. And then their goal was to return to Fort Henry the next morning. Well, there was another officer with them, Lieutenant William Lynn. Lynn, L-Y-N-N. He was more skilled on the western frontier fighting Indians. So he knew that if you marched down the river one path, you went back by another path. So when they got up that morning and Captain William Foreman started to march the company out back up the same path, he was green. He was over there in Hampshire County, new captain. He was green as he could be. He didn't know. William Lynn spoke up and said, Captain Foreman, you really shouldn't take your men back by the same path. We should go by the ridge this time. The trails from Fort Henry to Elizabethtown, there were two. There was one that went right along the river, and there's a terrain feature there called McMecken Narrows, and basically it was on the farm of William McMecken. So the Narrows was named after William McMecken. It's also called Grave Creek Narrows. But it's basically a rock cliff, kind of something like that wall right there. And I don't know, probably the length of this gym is what the Narrows was. And then you got the river. So it's a very small place to maneuver through. So basically on September 26th, they marched down to Elizabethtown through the Narrows. And then here goes William Foreman marching back through the Narrows back to Fort Henry. Well, the Indians across the river, they were watching. They crossed the river. They put trinkets, Indian trinkets in the trail. So when William Foreman's front men reached the trinkets, they're down looking at the trinkets, and they're kind of getting wary. The Indians are among them. So they're kind of looking around. At the same time, William Foreman's men close on them. When that happens, the Indians had set up blinds, off to the sides of the trail. Well, they dropped the blinds and they fired a large volley into Foreman's men. And the story is that 21 of Foreman's men were killed during that first volley. As the fighting continued, of course, the Indians had the upper hand because the rest of William Foreman's men, they were in the heat of battle. They didn't know, they knew they couldn't go that way, so they started scrambling to go up the hill. Well, here the Indians are coming up behind them, killing them, just as easy as they can be. Of course, you have William Lynn, who advised Foreman to go back along the ridge. Well, he took his men along the ridge. So, he's keeping same pace with Foreman. So he hears the fight begin. He hears the first volley of the Indians, and then he hears all the fighting. So his men takes up positions on the ridge to where they can shoot down at the Indians. but they are also seeing what is happening to the men that they were with. And basically, the Indians slaughtered them like cattle and left them where they lay. So that's pretty much the story of Captain William Foreman and his men. I think we're probably about out of time. Yeah. So, I mean, I could go on, if you like, I could go on and tell you, like, there's a list of Foreman's men that was there, if you'd like to know that.
Is it out there on Facebook or the web or somewhere?
I can put it out there, yeah. But I've done some further research on all of Foreman's, as much of Foreman's men as I can find. So I have a much larger list of those who were killed and then those that were injured. And basically I did that by researching all the sources that wrote about Captain Foreman's massacre. And I do have this photo of the headstone that was placed on the Ohio River at the site of Foreman's massacre, but when they built the locks in the Ohio River, that site ended up getting flooded, and that stone was underwater, that's what that damage is right there. So the SAR and DAR chapters in the area went and they moved that stone to Mount Rose Cemetery in Moundsville. And it is prominent just as soon as you go into Mount Rose Cemetery and you pull into the parking area, that stone is prominent just right there. Any questions?
It's very interesting.
Are you a SAR